Depois é você, depois eu. Ai, gente.
Que horas até que horas isso? De 10h30 até 11h15?
Tem uma hora. Não, é menos,
Uma hora.
É uma hora.
Uma hora?
É uma hora? Alguém vai? Alguém vai?
Então até que é bastante.
Espero que tenha perguntas, espero que não seja para mim.
Hi, everyone. We're back. So welcome to this session on sex education, gender at the illiberal frontier. It is part of a law transform project and one project, gender trouble, glocalization of gender politics, challenges for democracy and health. It is an ongoing conversation from Irene's incredible keynote on the roundtable that happened. And it's going to focus around the issue of sex education. So obviously, over the past few years, as we see the rise of the anti-rights movement, anti-sexual reproductive rights movement, a key issue that emerges obviously in addition to issues of contraception, issues of abortion, as well as other issues is related to the issue of sex education. The framing around these issues we've seen both within the context of Africa as well as the context of Latin America and in other places as well, Europe as well as South Asia. And part of this session is part of the project, especially around thinking around how especially the dynamics that relates to the rollback and the push against sex education happens both at the domestic level, at the international level, and engaging with regard to mapping out the transnational movement and actors that are engaged within this process and the discourses that they use as well. So this is the kickstart of the project, and we will appreciate especially your insights in terms of some of the emerging issues as well. I do have a fantastic panel here with us for the roundtable. They'll engage on looking at the issue of sex education from different perspectives, from the international perspective, to specifically issues of racial biases as it relates to that, but also country context in the context of Brazil. I will sort of also paint a bit of picture within the African context later on as well. But without wasting much time, I will like to introduce the members of the roundtable. So we have Juliana Alvin, Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. We have Livia Buzolin, FGV, Brazil. Ana Cortez from the University of Coimbra, Portugal, and the University of Bergen and Law Transform, as well as Bella Humelgen from the Central European University, Australia, and myself, Satang Nabane from the University of Dayton and the University of Pretoria. We'll start with Anna, and each of the panelists have about 5 minutes just to give us, the highlights of their interventions, and then we'll also open up the floor for engagement as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Satang. So can you hear me like this? Yeah. Like most of my colleagues here today, I'm originally from Brazil. But then, although I have conducted some research on sex education in Brazil, I have decided to focus for this panel on the cases linked to sex education decided by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, or the Inter-American Commission as well, and the European Court of Human Rights. I have also been lucky enough to be part of a project that built a comprehensive database on sexual and reproductive rights in international warfare. and you will all hear a little bit more about it during the keynote that will happen, will be held right after this panel by the brilliant Malcolm Langford. So in the European context, there is one decision about sex education from 1976, the case Schjelsen, Busk Madsen, and Pedersen versus Denmark. And then in this case, 3 couples claimed that compulsory sex education in Danish public schools violated their right to freedom of thought, consciousness, and religion, their rights to provide education and teaching according to their religious and moral values, and also that it was discriminatory on the basis of religion. We don't have time to discuss details of cases here, but in that case, the European Court of Human Rights has decided that the compulsory sex education in public schools in Denmark does not violate the parents' rights. And so this case was decided in the 70s. And ever since, if on the one hand, the mobilization in this European Court of Human Rights context hasn't stopped, on the other hand, the cases that have been filed have been declared inadmissible by the court. They are, in general, cases filed by couples, parents, and in some cases also by the child concerned. Some examples of those cases are Jimenez Alonso and Jimenez Merino versus Spain from 1999, Dojan and others versus Germany, 2011, and AR and LR versus Switzerland, 2017. All of them declared inadmissible by the court for being considered manifestly ill-grounded. When we look at the inter-American context, on the other hand, what we see are cases that are not focused on sex education, like the complaint filed is not focused on sex education, but the issue is there. It is brought up by amicus curiae interventions, and also you can see it in the court and commission reasoning, and also recommendations and even remedies. Some examples of these cases are Guzman Albarracin versus Ecuador, 2020, Manuela versus El Salvador, 2021, Angulo Lozada versus Bolivia, 2022, very recent cases. So European context cases are being declared inadmissible, usually cases filed by parents or the child against a sex education program that exists in inter-American context. On the other hand, cases that deal with, have another issue they focus on, for example, sexual violence in schools, and then this issue appears in reasoning, amicus curiae intervention, and even remedies as a way to fight and solve those problems, those very important issues. Besides that, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has issued several different press releases in favor of comprehensive sex education, acknowledging its importance and with several stances against initiatives that aim to prohibit or harm it in any way. I guess that's the overview.
Thank you, Anna. Livia?
Hi, I speak low. Is it okay? Are you hearing? Yeah. Okay, because otherwise I would grab the box. That's okay. So I will give like a genesis of the Brazilian case, how the discussion started in the country. So, and then my friends will complete me after. What I'm calling sex education in my, in the sense that what I will explain is the anti-discrimination measures or politics to avoid LGBT people and women to drop out schools. So I'm talking about the primary school, like secondary school. And what we have seen is a debate starting during the 2000s. And the issue started as a women rights thing. It was about not being discriminated on basis of sex. So it started to be introduced in the public arena as we need to in the first educational national plan, we need to teach people that women and indigenous people are human beings as well and not treat them as stereotypes and something like that. So this was the first national plan of education from 2000 to 2010. We have this kind of goals or guidelines. And then during mainly Lula's governments during 2005 to 2010, we have seen another kind of side politics like Brazil Without Homophobia. That was a program that designed by the federal government to have a protection of LGBT rights and gender identity in schools, mainly targeting that for those people to not drop out. And there was a pedagogic material that was being drawn and supposed to be distributed on schools, and this led to a huge backlash in Congress. So this material never got to the public, and it was about the same time that it's 2010 that the second national educational plan was being discussed in the Congress. So the temperature was like, oh, you're trying to teach kids to be gay in schools, to be promiscuous, something like that. So when the reaction comes in Congress, mainly, it was during the discussion of the second national educational plan during 2010 until 2014. And it was kind of an alliance between politics and civil society organizations that were against ideological teaching at schools. And then it became a broader sense. So it started as women's rights, then LGBT rights, and then the backlash came as what, in my assessment, against all kinds of critical thinking. So they were not just targeting gender and sexuality in schools, they also targeted Paulo Freire, that many of you know as the pedagogy of the oppressed. Mm-hmm. So all kind of the critical thinking was being targeted. And I kind of, I don't know, irony of the universe, one main congressperson that is targeting this kind of thing is also called Paulo Freire. So, I mean, it's like, wow, it's like, yeah. So just to give a point of the Brazilian touch. So, and then we actually, the second national plan passed without the initial provision that this was going to be a guideline to protect those people, passed without it. They also removed the gender flexion because in Portuguese, they use the neutral version that is all masculine, male, and they were trying to do like the flexion that would be female and male. That's also a big like thing in the discussion. And in the end, because of this alliance with Paulo Freire, Bolsonaro, who was a congressperson at the point, his kids as well, the second national plan passed without any provisions regarding sex education. And at municipal level and state level, a lot of bills were passing forbidding gender and sexuality discussions in school at all. So the critical thinking was like really targeted. So just to give a brief overview, in Brazil, we have some LGBTQ rights recognized by the courts, like same-sex marriage, gender identity, criminalization of homophobia and transphobia. So while those rights were being exercised, there was like this evil plan to forbid at all the discussion in schools. And I will stop there because I think Juliana will give what's the next chapter on courts about that. So, and Bella as well. So I will leave with that.
Thanks, Livia and Bella.
Good morning, everyone. So first of all, I want to thank the opportunity to be here and discuss with you this issue and also with my other panelists. I am Bella. I am a PhD candidate at Central European University in Austria, and not different from my other panelists, I'm also from Brazil. So we're going to have to stick with this country for now. I will build on what Livia said about the Brazilian context, but I'm going to focus more specifically on what happened during Bolsonaro's government. And I want to comment on two specific traits that I noticed, and when they were giving all of these discourses against education and against critical thinking, as Livia put it. And these traits are the anti-feminist discourse and also racism that comes up when they are talking about sex education and about critical thinking. I am going to base what I'm going to tell you mostly on what Bolsonaro himself has said, but also his Minister of the Woman, Family and Human Rights, Damares Alves. For those who are not familiar with the Brazilian context, she is evangelical pastor. She is ultra-conservative, and she got very popular during Bolsonaro government because she had this persona that would say very daring things, like that she thought that girls should wear pink and boys should wear blue. That was the first thing that she said as a minister. So I base a lot of what I'm going to say on things that like she has said in the past. And I want to start by telling a story, a very short story, because my time is also very short. In 2020, I was researching the policies of the came across some news that the ministry was promoting a witch hunt in children's book. And I was very intrigued by that because I am a fan of fantasy. So I was like, what is this? What is this actually? And there were a lot of testimonials by authors and publishers that they were refusing or like trying not to publish and produce children's book about witches and other mythological creatures because the government was threatening not to buy them for public schools. So it was a case of self-censorship. And then trying to understand what was the problem with witches and mythological creatures, I started researching into the speeches and interviews of political actors. And then I found out that they were mainly attacking two groups by trying to prevent witches and mythological creatures. And these groups were feminists and religious minorities, especially Afro-Brazilian religions and indigenous practices. And also for those of you who don't know too much about Afro-Brazilian religions and indigenous religions in Brazil, they are very discriminated. There's a lot of prejudice against their practices and even violence. So it was like a case of the government promoting the discrimination as well. And the way that they justified it was associating these religious practices with Satanism and saying that they were anti-Christian. So the whole point was that, and that's the words of Damares Alves, she says that teaching children about these religions in school could promote spiritual confusion in Christian kids. And that would be unconstitutional and undemocratic because Brazil is a Christian country and we should keep the Christian values. So it all ties back to Christianity. And similar thinking for the witches, because the witches are associated with feminists a lot, both because the feminists themselves claim the witch rhetoric. So there is like this famous now quote of, we are the granddaughters of the witches they couldn't burn. There is also feminists that claim witchcraft as a religious practice by worshipping goddesses. And there's also the historical perspective of witches being the subversive women during medieval times and also resisting to patriarchy, and which is also tied to the consolidation of capitalist mode of production, which Silvia Federici especially develops a lot. So there is this disassociation of witches with feminism. So they try to keep witches out of the school. Again, because witches are not Christian, or supposedly not Christian. So my whole point, my whole conclusion, and it's very twisted logic, a very twisted thinking to tie these fantasy characters with things that they consider subversive and anti-Christian, but it comes back to this white Christian gender order that was very central for Bolsonaro's government. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bella, and finally, Juliana.
Okay, so my co-panelists did a great work putting all the issues. I'll try to add something on that, and I will highlight 3 elements that I consider that are important. The first thing is related to the past. So before the current constitution, that is, we had authoritarian experiences that included censorship in the past. In Brazil, the most recent one from 64 to 85 or so. What is different now? Because we're talking about censorship, right? So we had, during the military dictatorship, we had the teaching of civic values, moral values at schools, anti-Marxist, anti-communist, communism, all that. So what is different now and how that relates to the past, right? I don't know, but it's a question that I wanted to pose because we have an additional element now that is, we have been discussing that gender ideology. But this movement in Brazil for censorship in schools, it's not limited to gender and sexuality. It's very centered in gender sexuality, this gender identity ideology thing. But it's also very anti-leftist, anti-Marxist, anti-communist indoctrination and all that. So these things come together. So I think there is an old element there and a new one. The second point I would like to highlight is how this specific debate is connected with the broader political tendencies and movements that we have seen in the past years, and that connects a lot with Livia was saying. We had, together with this persecution of teaching gender and sexuality mainly, but other things, we had, as I was saying in the other panel, this new liberal economical project. So the privatization, the state leaving the role of education to the families. So there was some initiatives to try to legalize homeschooling in Brazil. The Supreme Court struck down that, but it shows this tendency, this familistic tendency of shrinking the state and leaving the responsibility to the families, and the family is free to teach whatever they want. So, and cuts in education. So there is this economic aspect that plays a role here. And also the political aspect, because as Livia mentioned, in 2014, that was like during the impeachment process of former President Dilma Rousseff, this was an issue that was weaponized against our government, against her. So gender also plays a role there in all the attacks she suffered and her government and the impeachment she suffered. And the other thing related to this broader political context of the past years is the centrality of the Bolsonaro family in this whole thing. That is, well, the first, as Livia mentioned, this local legislation that were approved in many different municipalities and states. The first one was submitted by Flávio Bolsonaro, the son of Bolsonaro, that back then was a congressperson in the state of Rio. So they are very central in this debate since then, since 2014. And another aspect briefly is federalism, how federalism played a role on that, because when they didn't have the government, the federal government, they went locally. So, but then when they had the government, they went nationally. So that's part of the game. And my last point is on now and the Supreme Court and the cases that are pending. The Supreme Court has struck down some of these legislations, but refused to hear a broader case that would impact all the law. So we have some that were declared unconstitutional, but we had some that are still there in place, and cases pending. And some of the justices of the court chose to take a more procedural approach. And this is tricky because they didn't want to say, well, you can do that because of academic freedom or equality, anti-discrimination. They said, well, it's not the competence of municipalities to rule on education. So this could be a self-preserving strategy, but also we can see the cost of that in the future. And finally, to finish, I want to call attention to how the resistance to that is going on. So 2 weeks ago or so, the current government and Lula's government presented a proposal of reinserting sex education through the Ministry of Health. So again, social and economic rights being key for the advancement of this gender and sexuality agenda. And the group that is like mostly leading the mobilization around this issue are teachers, school teachers. So it's interesting to see how through education also the resistance is done. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Juliana, and thank you to their speakers for illustrating both in terms of the Brazilian context, especially around politicization of the issue of comprehensive sexuality education or sexual education, but also Anna with the broad strokes from the international perspective as well. I'll say a little bit about the African Context Limited. Obviously, I'm not from Brazil, so which is cool. But yeah, I think one is, as I said, part of the motivation for the project really is around how we can sort of map out both in terms of the processes that are happening at the domestic level, but also its interlinkage. I think one of the groups that we know, Citizen Go, which is, I think, originally based in Spain, but we've seen its work, obviously, in quite a number of African countries, including in South Africa, in Kenya, in Ghana. We recently did work trying to map out the anti-rights movement and its connections with especially US-based right-wing organizations, and there is their connection both in terms of resources, but also in terms of the utility of discourses as well. So, for example, the charge of neocolonialism and how sex education is against family values, is against child welfare, are all discourses that we've actually seen within the context of the US or other contexts where African-based organizations that are working against comprehensive sexuality education are using those languages as well. We've also seen, especially within the Eastern and Southern African context, during the time at the end, around end of 2020, when there was supposed to be the renewal of the Eastern and Southern African ministerial commitments that really tries to scale up the provision of comprehensive sexuality education. There was a lot of pushback, and we've seen a lot of campaign, even within the South African context, where we've seen the campaign Stop CSE, which was also supported by the US-based Family Watch International, as well as other groups as well. And that also we've also seen that within the Kenyan context, but also within the Ghanaian context as well. So recently, we actually had a published paper out of that in Public African, where we were trying to showcase that, especially with the rise of the anti-SRR movement within the African context, but connecting it to other transnational movement and actors, there is a conversation about how they use neo-colonial arguments, Western arguments. I know Juliana raised the issue of gender ideology, obviously within the African context. We haven't seen the utility of that concept, unlike in the Latin American context as well. But I do think what the project really aims to do is to sort of, as I said, illustrate what are the discourses on the ground as it relates to comprehensive sexuality education. Who are the transnational actors? What are their linkages? Obviously, given that there is little research, especially that shows similarities and differences within the Latin American context, within Africa, within Europe, and within South Asia. We'll stop here, and we have about 20-25 minutes, so which is really great. We're good at time. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So yes. So yeah, so this is, so I'll open it up and people can use the box and come in front, both in terms of questions, or we can throw it, whatever works for you. Both in terms of questions and comments around the issue of, sexuality education, the politicization of the issue, as well as its connection, especially around democratic processes and some of the things that we've been talking around within the broader framework of reproductive justice and democracy as well. So you're welcome. Who wants to go first? Yes, I.
So thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I had two remarks, I don't know, more remarks than questions. The first one is I have been working a little bit on the way this comprehensive sex education was done in Tunisia. So it's about 10 years ago. So maybe it has changed. And I thought, talking to the people who were there and also other who worked for the UNFPA or IPPF, but local people, that one main issue in post-colonial contexts is exactly what you were saying, so that several ideas are conceived of by at least some part of the population, also politicians, but also ordinary people, as something exogenous coming from previous colonizers, and that it doesn't fit in the identity or so supposed version of the identity of the local society. So there is a strong opposition also in the name of, in the case of the Arab countries, of the Islam or whatever, so a kind of interpretation of Islam, what Islam says. So this is, I think, an important issue maybe to be considered if, I don't know in Brazil, but in many other contexts. And the other elements, and I don't know in this project how it will be declined, but I think it would be interesting to look precisely at the content of this comprehensive sex education. What is exactly in? Because what I saw, so for example, in Tunisia, I was quite surprised. So when I attended some of the seminars for local young people who were supposed to then, spread the message to their peers, was that they were using materials from the 1970s and 80s, mainly coming from Egypt, that was extremely gendered. So it was, I was surprised. I mean, they were supposed to do exactly the contrary, so say that, no, and they were saying completely the opposite. So they were saying that male have this sexual drive, and so you have to understand the men's sexuality in a way, and no, women, they have this psychological, emotional. So it was like, and then they were showing small, videos showing how a girl has to learn to be a girl and stay, to play her role as a girl and not pretend to be like her brother. So I was like completely shocked by the content. But when they started the course, they were saying, no, we are against gender distinctions and discrimination. So it was completely contradictory. So it was extremely interesting. And the other thing is that living in Switzerland, I had last year a master's student who stayed for 6 months with sex educators in the schools. And she was just trying to observe the way they teach about transsexual people, non-cisgender, etc. And she had to go through ethics committee. And okay, at the end, after 6 months, she got the clearing. And but the schools were opposed. So the directors of the schools and the parents. So, and she was just attending. She was not, but the idea, because she had to write a letter, and it was a complete opposition to that in the local society. So in Switzerland. So I don't know. It's just to.
Yes. So I just want to. Can I just make one comment? So of course, of course, we all know that children has been sort of internationally very central in the sort of campaign against contestation processes, but also in the campaign against gender ideology, right? So in many countries, including Eastern Europe, including in Africa, the focus on preventing propaganda directed at children has been very central. Laws have been passed. And this is very interesting because it's a little bit similar to abortion, that we thought that we were safe in a way, that this debate is not going to come here, and then suddenly it was there. But what we also see now, and it has been emerging in the past few years, and Anna just showed us yesterday, a flyer from one of the political parties in Norway in the local elections that are coming up in a couple of weeks. And this has started to emerge, particularly around transgender, that children should not be confused. Children, it shouldn't be. And so they had as one of their central points, it's a very marginal one, very sort of conservative right-wing Christian party, but still, they had this sort of, that one of their main points was that the focus on pink competence in kindergartens and schools were harmful and should be removed. And I think that that there is actually quite a lot of traction more broadly. So it's very fringe, but it's a debate that is starting, and where there are very interesting alliances created. And also, as we know internationally, around trans is particularly complicated, because also part of the feminist movement is sort of being drawn in on some of the rhetoric, and it's a really, really complex type of alliance that is being created around trans and around sort of the way in which communicate that to in schools and kindergarten. So I just want to, yeah.
Thank you very much. This was such an excellent panel. I'm really appreciative of all your insights. So I just want to flesh out two things. The first one is kind of tied up to what Irene just mentioned about, I am very, very curious about the pedagogy of these materials. And of course, like, we cannot escape like the broader tension between groups. However, I believe that when one opens the Pandora box, then these things usually happen. And what comes next, for example, is grievances and tensions and so on. So in diverse countries, when this Pandora box is just opening, be it gender and be it race, for instance, how would you believe the pedagogy could play in favor of a more reconciliatory language, especially because when one group has been dominant in one society, then unavoidably comes guilt, right? Comes those feelings. I was struck by having lived in the US and then coming to Germany. I love this author, Tupoka Oged. She wrote the first book of racism in Germany. So speaking before an audience who has never, a white audience who has never ever experienced, or who in her words lived in happy land, you know. So she kind of wrote about this cycle of experiencing guilt and undergoing these emotions that really speak to the majoritarian, if I may, group. So that's the first question. I would love to hear about the pedagogy and whether the extent to which this can be tied up to other intersectional aspects of gender, such as race, which is very, very pressing. And the second, quite quickly, what are your thoughts about, especially in the Brazilian context? I loved Juliana's intervention about this economic and the political aspects as well, and also how Anna indicated the advancements by the Inter-American Court, how journalism in Brazil plays a role, and the political economy of it, particularly in Mexico. We are seeing that the big tycoon, TV Azteca, for example, is pushing back against the books in primary schools for the first time, raising the issue of racism in Mexico.
Thank you all. This is a really excellent panel. It strikes me that a sort of common thread between the earlier topic and this is that these are sort of, the common thread is this is about control, right? Like control over women's bodies, control over sexuality, imposing Christian norms, sort of traditional family values. So I wonder, and this is sort of an open question for the room as well as for the panel, what might be constructive or effective framing to kind of counter this in sort of legal terms, right? So I wonder if like self-determination of children, if that could be framed as a right? The ability for children to make their own choices, have their own set of, with full information, the ability to choose their own gender identity or, relationships, those sorts of things. Thank you.
Thanks. It was a great panel. And thinking about the project, I just wanted to ask you how methodologically you're proposing to trace these transnational networks of these people. And we'll talk about it more in the next panel as well. We've been trying to do that, but it's actually quite hard. Yeah? So what are your thoughts on how you're going to do that?
Thank you. So it was lovely hearing all of you. This is a subject that really interests me, and it's amazing seeing so many Brazilian women researching it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, specifically in the Brazilian scenario, there is this thing of focusing a lot on prohibiting access to information. And so during Damari's position as the ministry, they released a campaign together with the Ministry of Health of waiting is the best option. And there's a total disregard to helping kids. And as Juliana mentioned, the abortion cases involving really young kids in Brazil. So there's this whole thing of like, okay, we need to protect kids from this speech and this, dangerous ideas. But once they are already in that position, once they are already, starting their sexual life or they are pregnant and stuff like this, we're completely abandon them and we're going to responsibilize them for the choices they make. So I wonder how this is also going to be, if so, this is also going to be considered in the project of how, this access to sex education and controlling of behavior is going to be dealt with. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just real quick, something that came to my mind when Ryan was making his comment, and right now is maybe turning back to the first panel about academic freedom, how we can stick to that right specifically, maybe focusing on the teachers and the people who are occupying schools to make some sort of resistance concerning this, because once again, academic freedom is mainly focused on higher education, but what we are observing, especially through the context in Brazil, is that prohibiting those people to talk about gender, to talk about critical race, and actually forming and teaching these kids is also part of another framework, legal frame of violations that not just concerns the rights of the kids, but also the rights of the educators. So maybe bit reflection on that. No, I won't throw it.
Satan?
Wanna start with Juliana? Okay. Okay. So thank you, everyone. Just to say, we do not have any answers. All of those are questions that we are addressing in the development stage. Yesterday, we had an incredible first meeting, per se, after the email exchanges, and we are going to have another project meeting tomorrow. And part of the ongoing work is really fleshing out, especially Rachel's question around methodology. And that's why all of us have a paper and pen ready for your session, the next session, in terms of mapping those out, especially the linkages between domestic actors and transnational movements as well. I think just from our own experience, we got to doing the small mapping that I mentioned, and that was like just 3 countries, and specifically on abortion, CSC, as well as LGBTIQ+ issues. I think we sort of combed a lot, most of their websites as well. I think we started from a point where we were able to at least have a starting point of the conservative movements that have connections in Africa. So, and this is just generally, especially what we've now seen within the African context, is that most of the northern-based conservative movements and organizations actually have African headquarters. And they are also, it's also interesting how as well that they also have African representatives and speakers. So it's not necessarily that somebody from the US or somebody from Europe is the one that is running the Africa office. These are actually African. So, for example, there are a couple of very known people in Kenya, for example, as well as other places. And I think in terms of the mapping as well, what we've also seen especially is the connection, you know, how they target, especially African politicians during UN sessions. So during UN sessions now, there are meetings of African politicians by conservative movements. And we've also seen quite a bit of that as well, you know, in Ethiopia as well as in other spaces as well. And then I think social media also has been a useful tool, and especially in trying to just map out, you know, some of the languages as well. And I think particularly of interest within this project as well will be, especially with regard to the legal discourses and legal strategies. We've seen that very clearly, especially when it relates to issues of abortion, for example, how some of the legal discourses and the languages that are being introduced within the South African context, for example, are very similar to what we've seen in Texas or in Kentucky or with some of the Supreme Court cases as well and interlinkages with that. But there is a lot of work. And I think one of the areas that we found very difficult was with regard to mapping out the money, right? Tracing the money. There is a lot of money coming from northern-based organization, but obviously there's a lot of work as well, especially in terms of mapping that out. I you know, just in brief as well. And just on the last question, I think on academic freedom, one of the key questions that we have, especially as we look at country case studies, is you know, the interlinkages between sexual education, comprehensive sexuality education, as well as broader freedoms and values, right? So talking about freedom of speech, talking about academic freedom and what that entails within this context as well. Briefly, I'll invite my colleagues to say a little bit about some of the questions, just you can, but obviously this is what we wanted, these critical questions that will be very useful as we work on developing this project as well. We'll start with Juliana and we'll come this way and before we conclude. Go ahead. Okay. Thank you.
Very briefly on this methodological aspect, it's super big challenge, and I think there is a layer that complicates it. It's the nationalistic aspect of this movement. So it's not clear these connections. They don't want to advertise these connections because they are patriotic, they are Brazilians, they are so they don't want to. So it's very well hidden, and they have the people there doing the work. So I think that adds something that complicates more our lives, but yes. And on what Irene was mentioning, yes, I think we all would agree that with like this argument of traditional Brazilian or original or autochthonous values that are being invaded, it's not a thing in Brazil. I don't know if we don't have the means to argue that because like our traditional values are not that like that Puritan maybe, but maybe it's that, I don't know. But the thing is, it's not a thing for us. This is not an argument. And the other thing that I would call attention to is something that was also in the academic freedom panel, is the role of technology on that. And I think that interacts with the concerns about the normative aspect of this and about control and all that, because these spread a lot through social media, and it played a huge role during the elections. And we had these 2 episodes during the Bolsonaro's elections that was him in the biggest news show in Brazil, bringing a book that was not even used in schools, but showing it and saying, well, this is what the children are being taught. And this was in the most watched news show in Brazil, like 1-2 weeks before the elections and the big fake news of the 2018 election. That was the, how to say mamadeira in English? Baby bottle. The baby bottle of penis. This was the fake news, you know, these feeding bottles for babies that allegedly the government or leftist government was distributing everywhere these bottles with penis on top, so children drink on a penis. And it's crazy, but in 48 hours, in 48 hours, it was more than 3 million views, like super quick, and that really played, it's crazy, but it really played a role in the election. And then, of course, this whole fake news debate and all that, but that relates with what Talia was saying, that is the role of journalists. Nowadays, there is a certain mea culpa from journalists for the fact that they gave space for this kind of stuff, like bringing Bolsonaro to the shows over the last decade because he was a funny character and all that, and now they are rethinking their approach to this kind of thing, not to amplify this kind of insane fake news, right?
Yeah, thank you very much, Juliana. So we have about 4 minutes, so a minute and some seconds for each person.
Okay, just so very quickly, I'm going to try to bring this this question that came up a lot by Irene, by Talia, and also Larissa about the content of comprehensive sex education. And I also think it ties up with Ryan's question about the legal framing and how can we counter this movement, right? Because they are coming with really strong arguments and really strong images and this whole Christian values, and we have to somehow come up with an answer, right? I don't think I'm qualified to say what should be the content of sex education for children because that's not my field. But I do see it, for example, when I was talking about the children's book with like mythological like creatures and witches and stuff. So there is like a way of teaching children through like more ludic like references to like education is always like age specific. Education is always targeted for that age, any education, not only about sex, but about anything else. So it's not something that is going to come up all at once, the debate that we have to build, I think. But I think the importance of having these discussions with children and teenagers then ties up with what the argument that the legal argument that we can come up with, which is in many cases to prevent violence as well, because Brazil has a huge rate of sex violence against children. So it is important to teach children how to prevent violence and to be open about talking about these things with teachers and with their parents and with other adults. So yeah, I'm going to stop here because I don't want to take more time.
Thank you, Bella. Livia?
Okay, just few points. One of the points that I think is worth mentioning is how the crusade on gender ideology was so successful in Brazil was also because became a private surveillance of teachers, of groups, of discussions. So even though Damaris, the well-known Damaris, she puts gender ideology in the Human Rights Handbook. So you could call a hotline for human rights complaints in Brazil during this period and say, oh, I have a teacher that is indoctrinating kids. So, but this was only working because you have these private actors acting as surveillance, and that's why teachers were so scared, so afraid. Even after the Supreme Court decision, they are still afraid. So that was one point I would like to mention, how the private and the family, this kind of thing took part in this work. Also about the legal framing, Juliana can complement me, but I think the way the Supreme Court addressed the issue for me is really problematic because they address in one hand from the formal aspect, in the other hand they try to go for the academic freedom and the rights of the teachers, and they didn't touch on the core thing that was gender discrimination and sexuality discrimination. They were just touching, but none of the votes were like, this is a problem, we need to address that this is why we need to talk about these schools. So to be like running in circles created a problem. So, and I don't think dressing like sorry, I forgot how to say it. Self-determination of children would be an answer, because that's what the conservative field is expecting. So that kids can decide, and logically they will decide to be Christian and heteronormative. So that's also an argument that can be used both sides. And in the way that I see, the conservative wing can win this kind of argument. So my point of view, sorry, I have the time.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So
Thank you. Anna, you have 30 seconds.
Oh my God. Yeah, so I
1 minute.
the methodological question in general, of course, we can't have an answer now, but starting small, I will soon submitting an article about mobilization in courts in Brazil and in Colombia. I'm writing together with Juliana Jaramillo, so that's something I have something to do about. To say about. I'm always also interested in this inter-American and European cases, like who is taking the cases to court, even if it's the individual ones, like is it parents, kids, and so on, and who is intervening? Who are those or civil society organizations acting as a michikuri that are taking this comprehensive sex education issue to the courts? Who are they? And also what are the arguments? Of course, here there's no time for explaining details on that, but which are the arguments from the people taking the cases to those courts? Which are the arguments from the courts themselves and from the third-party interventions as well? And even with the content, like people are taking cases to the European Court of Human Rights because they don't agree to sex education as it's done in a few European countries. How is it done? What is this content? What is that's so disturbing to them? And also in the Inter-American, they are offering or suggesting comprehensive sex education as a solution. What is this content that there is a solution, and how are we going to follow up on that, monitoring these decisions? What's going to happen after we have a beautiful decision or a beautiful stance arguing for comprehensive sex education?
Thank you. Please join me in thanking my colleagues and Siri.
No, I just want to say that you might not have noticed, you might not realize that this discussion will actually continue tomorrow, because we have a session tomorrow that seems to be about something else. Why does no, but just listen. So the title of the session is "Why does the anti-liberal counter movement care about the Norwegian child protection services?" And it's actually not the same thing. So and we have lots of time in that session tomorrow, because some people couldn't make it. But so we can continue this discussion tomorrow, because it is actually sort of another prism of this same question around gender ideology and the role of the family in society. But before that, in about 15 minutes, Malcolm will talk about how to study in national courts.
Thank you, everyone.
No.